You ever get into a situation where, like I said earlier, you're so overwhelmed by your own circumstances that you're almost like, what's the use of even praying? You feel so overwhelmed, so much pressure that it's like there's no hope. I'm not even going to pray. What's the use? Well, here's the use. God plus one is always a majority. Do you know that? Think about that. God plus one individual whose heart beats at the same pace as God and cares about the same thing as God is always a majority. You say, well, we're just one family, or I'm just one person, or we're just one little small church. Yes, but you can pray. I think some of the most meaningful times here on this earth is our time spent in prayer. And God can do immeasurably more than we could ever ask or imagine when one person, even one person, is devoted to praying for a certain situation. But we're only one church. God plus one is always a majority. So let me give you some more backstory behind this whole thing. A year and a half goes by. We're still not moved up here yet. Still don't know what it looks like. And around that same time, this church, which I knew nothing about, didn't know what the Christian and Missionary Alliance was, CMA. Some of you don't know what the CMA. I thought it was the Christian Music Awards or the Christian Motorcycle Association. Those would have been my first two guesses. I had no idea about the Christian and Missionary Alliance until my friend introduced me to him. But this church was really struggling too. But they made a choice. They made a choice that every single Friday night they would gather at this place. This didn't look like this. You go downstairs and you see all the kids' own stuff. It wasn't like that. It was a bunch of rooms that were storage closets, basically. Nothing happening down there. And so they walked the walls. A small group of people, like 10, 12 people, Fran? Walked the walls, and they prayed. And they prayed. And they came up here and they would pray because what mattered to God mattered to them. So, fast forward, and we come up here again for a vacation in December. And we send out postcards to family and friends, and we invite them to this information meeting, some of which you're here today. And you were at that meeting long, long ago. But I just casted a vision of what this church was going to look like. We felt called to either start a church or partner with an existing church, but had no idea what that was going to look like. But we were committed to moving up here. And so we have this information meeting, but I have my notes, right? And I don't have any place to put my notes. So I can't just do this. This is uncool. Like, imagine if I was just holding my sermon the whole time. So I asked my friend Ben, who was one of my best friends from college. He was a youth pastor in the Christian Music Award Association. And so I was like, Ben, do you know anyone who has like a music stand here in town? He's like, yeah, my Uncle Ken is an elder at a church in town. Why don't I give him a call and see if he can bring a music stand over? Ken Lyman over here. So Ken shows up to this library and he's like, what are you doing? Like, what is this all about? And I remember giving him a bulletin and, he went on his way. Well, I didn't know this until like weeks, maybe even a couple months later, when this position became open. But their pastor, the former pastor here, resigned that week or perhaps even that day from his position. How do you orchestrate that? Do you realize Aaron and I live in Texas at this point, want to come up to Wellsville, and we have no idea how that's going to happen. This was in 2008 when the housing crisis was like, It took 3 years for people to sell their house. We were going to have to sell their house. And oh, by the way, 3 months prior to that, there was a hurricane that hit our area, destroyed our roof and our fence. How do you sell a house with a bad roof and no fence? It was a horrible situation, and yet people began to pray. And even though there was points in that timetable where I was like, I don't know what the use is anymore. I'll stop reading. I'll stop praying. I'm not sure if this is going to happen. And yet over and over, God reminded me, God plus one is always a majority. God plus one in your life is always a majority. People that are willing to pray for the things that only God can do. Let me I'll just give you one more backstory to Arcade. I'm just full of stories today. And that's what happens when you don't preach for 4 weeks in a row. So I said, this could be a long sermon, maybe. But Arcade, when we went ahead with the Arcade campus, It was all approved, just totally a God thing and how that all happened. But so we start renovating. Renovation day one, it was September 2014. We get into their sanctuary, and one of the first things that we have to do as part of renovations is to get rid of a whole bunch of stuff that's been collected over 30 or 40 years, just because it's just all over the place. And we tried to transform their sanctuary to something that looks similar to the other campuses. So we get in there, and my job was to move the pulpit. Okay, and it's not like this pulpit. It's kind of like this big ship, from Star Trek, It's like huge, massive pulpit. I just don't like those things. I like to be with you people, not behind here. But so there's this thing with a bunch of shelves, and I was going to move it, but before I moved it, and keep in mind, they hadn't used the sanctuary for 5 years. 5 years they hadn't used the sanctuary because they were trying to save heat, so they were meeting in the fellowship hall, which is now their cafe. So I look, and there's a whole bunch of papers. I was like, how could there be a whole bunch of papers? They haven't met here in 5 years. So I start pulling them out, and one bulletin caught my eye. And the reason why it caught my eye was because the bulletin, the date of that service, was the exact same date that I started here in Wellsville 9 years ago. So I was like, that's weird. So I pull that out, and I open it. On the back side of the bulletin, there's prayer requests. And one of the first prayer requests says this: please be in prayer for Pastor Jeremy Gorham and his wife Erin and their sons as they transition from Texas to New York this week. Isn't that amazing? How does that happen? I'll tell you why it happens. It's because God plus one is always a majority. When people kneel down and pray for the things that only God can do, God shows up. Amen?